So welcome, thank you for being here. My name is Ariana Wood, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a senior Lean advisor with Results Washington. I've been focused on Lean for about 8 years now, and I've had the pleasure of working with several different state agencies applying Lean principles and thinking. And I'm excited to be with you here. So today we're going to talk about what Lean in Washington is. And you can think of this session like a box of chocolates. You're going to get a little bit of a lot of different flavors. So there might be things in this session that I talk about for 1 minute that there's whole entire books or multi-day trainings on. So just know that you're not going to walk out an expert in anything. But what you will walk out with is some names of terms, tools, understanding some general philosophy, and begin to understand how you might be able to fit applying Lean in your daily life. So we will hear how we define Lean in Washington State, get some insight into our state's journey, learn about some common Lean terms and tools, and then understand that it's a lot more than tools, and take some reflection and actions or identify something we can act on when we leave. So Lean's origins go back very far. If you want to geek out on it, you can take it all the way back to Venetian boat building. But you might have heard of things more recent, like last century, where companies like Ford or Boeing were applying Lean during World War II. But undoubtedly, the company that popularized Lean and did the most with the culture to make it what it is today that we know is Toyota. And Toyota created a whole system where they also focused on respect for people and creating employees as problem solvers that is part of what we look to embody today. Since Toyota has been doing their work, several other industries have also come into play in addition to manufacturing, and those include things like retail, healthcare, and government. Washington has been a leader across the nation in applying Lean in government, and at the same time, there's many other states, counties, and even some countries that are applying Lean in government as well. The word Lean itself actually doesn't even come from Toyota. It was MIT researchers who were observing Toyota's business practices, and it's not an acronym. It's just the name of the thing. So while some people have some creative interpretations that they try to make it an acronym, it's actually not one. So Washington State also has a rich history of performance management and process improvement. So if you were in the state back in 2012, around the time when we started, a lot of people thought of Lean as the flavor of the month. But at Results Washington, we like to encourage people to think of Lean as not the next passing phase, but rather we're building on really robust systems that we've had before, so it complements, not contradicts. And originally, we had a lot of support from private partners when we started. And like a lot of organizations at the beginning, we focused heavily on training and projects. But we quickly realized that we needed to go beyond that, because you can't have long-term sustainable results with Lean if you don't do things like build management systems and focus a lot on culture. So that's what we've been doing over the last several years, and that's what we want to continue to do, is build sustainable systems and culture. So what is Lean? If you ask different people what Lean is, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. And as I was just alluding to, even our own interpretation or understanding of Lean has changed and evolved over time. When I first started learning about Lean, we had this very popular phrase, process, not people. And what that was meant to capture is that if you're having a business problem, you shouldn't assume that people are the cause. You shouldn't blame people first. Because the truth is, it's really hard to be successful in processes that are filled with waste, burden, and non-value things. So that was a really well-intentioned phrase, process not people, because it's trying to shift away from a blame culture when we have business problems and really look at how can we improve our processes. But the phrase misses something that's really important, which is that at its core, Lean is all about people. We've got respect for people, knowing what your customers want, employees that are engaged. It's all about people. So we've expanded our definition to ensure that we don't just focus on tools. So Lean is a way of leading and working, built on respect and humility, that uses continuous improvement to produce great results for customers. So lean is for everyone, every day. And it's really about a way that we work, almost like a philosophy, a lens through which we view our working worlds. And you can use it on big, really complex multi-agency problems, and you can also use it all the way down to things like small incremental improvements in your own daily work. Just a couple weeks ago, we were having a team meeting, and my coworker Jessica pointed out the fact that we almost never have outgoing mail. And yet every day, someone comes and checks that. So they walk to the door and they open the door, which is sometimes locked, and then they walk down a short hallway, and then they look in the box and nothing's there, and they turn around and they leave. And Jessica said, you know, what if we just put a visual cue up? What if we put some sign that we can flip around, maybe color code it, so that the person can see from far away that they don't need to come into the office? Brilliant, right? So simple. That kind of improvement is the type of thing that we can all have access to every day. And it's not just the improvement itself, it's also the mindset of being able to want to improve and to recognize improvement opportunities. But I gotta be honest, creating a culture where lean is for everyone every day, it's not easy. And our ability to do it as a state has been influenced by some of our own journey. For example, when we started back in 2012, we had a tool called value stream mapping, and it was a way of mapping out your process, and it tended to happen in 5-day events. And we had some great results with that. It was a fantastic way to start. And yet what started to happen is that after a while, people started to say that you can't use lean unless you have a 5-day event, which is totally not true. So we learned that we needed to go beyond just having events as our main method or our only strategy. The other thing that started to happen early on was that we found ourselves building sort of an expert-led culture. And so we sent a lot of agencies sent people to training or to get certifications. Well, training and certifications are awesome, don't get me wrong. I've taught trainings and been a lean facilitator myself. And there's rigor in training and knowledge gaps filled, and if you're lucky, experience gained. But what we saw toward the beginning of our journey was that agencies might send a whole bunch of people out, and then they came back to the agency into an environment where they didn't have systems and cultures to necessarily support them being successful. So what I would encourage for you, if you're getting trained and you have contact with your leaders, or for any leaders in the room, think about what systems and culture you need in your agency to ensure that the person who gets trained has support when they come back and need to apply it. Because training tends to lose its value if you don't get to apply it. So I've talked about a couple things that we learned early in our journey as a state that we needed to adjust. And now let's focus on some things that we learned that we know we need to improve or continue to grow into. And one of the biggest of those is culture. And a lean culture is one where human experience matters. So I just said human experience matters, and yet there's a picture of an iceberg up on the screen. So what's that about? The reason for that is that an iceberg is a really great analogy for culture. So icebergs, everyone pretty much knows that you can just see the tip above the water, but the majority of the iceberg is underneath the surface. And much like an iceberg, lean culture has aspects of things that you can see from the outside. You might walk around an environment and see things like visual management or different kinds of displays of processes. But a lot of what drives lean culture is underneath the surface. And those are things that tend to be values, beliefs, and mindsets. And in lean, those values, beliefs, and mindsets are really, really important. So imagine you are going to your first problem-solving training, and you're jazzed, you get excited, like you're learning a lot of cool things, and at your training, the trainer says, problems are good, and the only way you can solve problems is to surface them. We don't want to create a culture where problems are good so that we can solve them. And you go back to your organization and you go to your manager and you say, oh my gosh, there's this thing that's been bugging me for so long, and I think that I know a method that can help with this problem. And the manager says, whoa, whoa, whoa. First, we do not have problems here. We may have opportunities, or we may need to streamline some things, but we do not have problems. And second, what do you want to air our dirty laundry? Like, put that away. So that's an example of where you can't just have a tool and you can't just send people to learn things. You have to have culture that supports lean. You have to have mindsets and principles that partner with the other tools. So on the screen is just a few of the mindsets and beliefs that we would encourage in a lean culture. Very important ones, though. And so respect is a key one. Respect for people, that we are all human beings and we all have something to contribute. Valuing diversity, the fundamental belief that diversity makes us stronger, and that we want to listen deeply to each other to understand our perspectives and where we're coming from. And at the same time, you want to approach problem solving with a humble mindset, because it's very hard to be open to new ways of solving problems if you already think you know the answer. And it's very hard to truly listen to your employees, who should be the ones closest to the work, who are improving the work. It's very hard to listen to them adequately if you think you know everything. So especially for leaders who might be shifting roles or changing the way that they lead in a lean culture, it's really important to approach problem solving with humility. And then you can brag about it when you get awesome results. So I mentioned problems are good. The only way you can solve problems is if you're willing to talk about them and surface them. And it's okay to make mistakes. You know, we also heard this morning that play is a really important aspect of life, and that it helps people get results quicker. If you're in an environment where you're a fear-based environment where you're gonna get punished when you experiment with something and you make a mistake, it's gonna be a lot harder for you to apply lean in that environment. So these are some of the things culturally that we want to focus on in a lean environment. And these connect to valuing people. Some of those people are customers. You'll hear the term in lean that customers define value. And another way of saying that is that our processes should produce what the customer wants and needs, and ideally with the least amount of waste involved. So with our customers, it can be very easy to identify customers in an environment where it's like retail. So there's something produced and the customer is the one that goes and buys the thing. In state, it can be a little bit trickier. So imagine Washington State Patrol. Their job is to help keep us safer, and yet one of their services is to provide speeding tickets to people. So who is the customer in that transaction? When you're dealing with a transaction that's essentially regulatory, how does the customer define value there? So I could say, you know, I'm sorry, officer, that ticket is not value added to me, and I don't want it or need it, so you can just keep that. I mean, I can try and say that, but in all seriousness, identifying the customer in our environment can be more challenging. So we are all customers of that process because we all benefit from safer roads. And a lot of state services are like that. They're benefiting the Washingtonian ultimately. But there's a direct recipient of the product or service, and that's the person who's getting the ticket in that analogy. And so maybe they can't say, I don't want the ticket, but they can say, I deserve getting that ticket in a respectful way with an efficient process that's also safe. So those same lean principles and thinking apply to that interaction. The other thing we have a lot of in the state is internal handoffs. I used to process licensing applications, and as part of that processing, sometimes my licensing unit would have to send the application to the enforcement unit if something needed to be checked out. And so licensing and enforcement are both serving the same customer, and we were both at the same organization. And yet, it's really important that I apply lean principles and thinking to that internal handoff as well. So while we're both partners in the process that's delivering value to the customer, even if the enforcement unit doesn't match exactly our technical definition of customer, I still want to make sure that I'm passing off work to them that is quality work, that doesn't have defects, that's happening smoothly and on time. There's another really key component, which is that listening to customers is very, very important. And listening to customers can sometimes happen through formal means, like surveys or focus groups. but it can also just be the transactions that you're having on a daily basis. So someone on a phone call tells you that something they did in that process was difficult for them and they didn't like it. How can you use that feedback that you hear to make improvements? Or if it's out of your control to influence that, how can you capture that feedback and encourage systems within your agency to be able to revisit that feedback for future improvements? So listening to our customers is really important. Identifying who they are. You can't listen to them if you don't know who they are. And then using their feedback to make improvements. So we're talking about culture, and the culture where human experience matters. And some of those humans we pay attention to are customers. And some of the other humans we want to pay attention to are employees. So we matter in this equation too, right? So in a lean organization, the people who are closest to the work improve the work. And that can be different from some traditional management or organizational styles. So sometimes in traditional or hierarchical management, leaders figure out everything themselves and they tell everybody what to do. And lean is kind of the opposite of that, where the people who are closest to the work should be the ones engaging how to make the improvements to make that work better. And there's a lot of challenges with this as well that can sometimes happen. For example, if leaders, even if they're well-intentioned and they see, we want to do lean as an organization, but you have to do this, this, and this, and this, and lean becomes a punitive thing, that tends to degrade the employee's experience and the engagement around lean. And then if leaders aren't aware of how their actions or their leadership styles are influencing people, and maybe they aren't giving people the autonomy or listening to employees' ideas, that can make it very difficult. So all the things we talked about earlier, respect, humility, problems are good and mistakes are okay, and diversity is a valuable thing, those are all things that need to be embodied to support employees as well. So one of the easiest ways to understand how lean can benefit employees is just to dive into the tools and principles, fundamental pillars. And one fundamental pillar around lean is continuous improvement. In fact, some people even use continuous improvement and lean interchangeably. If you boil it down, continuous improvement just means change for the better. And it's again, having a mindset, a drive to want to always be improving and making your products and services better, as well as knowing how to do that. So having tools and methods that can support you on that journey. So before we launch into the tools themselves, I want to share with you a couple things that commonly come up and sometimes get in people's way so that we can kind of put those aside. And one of those is about language. So I already mentioned that Toyota popularized lean, and so a lot of the terms that you'll hear in lean are Japanese. In addition, there's a lot of different types of lean methods, and some of them are more technical than others. So you might hear things like histograms or statistical controls and not know what those are. So sometimes when you're using foreign language or really technical language, people feel intimidated and they don't want to engage, and they think that lean isn't for them. And again, lean should be for everyone every day. So it's not that those terms are bad, but that we want to be careful about when we're using them, and we want to make sure that we can also try and connect with people that don't necessarily know those terms. Going to the Gemba just means the place where the value-added work is happening. It's a Japanese word, Gemba. And you don't have to know the translation to actually do the right thing in that scenario. All you have to know, really, is that you can learn a lot, and you can get a whole lot of valuable information by going and seeing the work where it's happening and talking to the people who are actually doing the work. So you can describe it in simple, plain talk terms like that. You don't have to use the foreign or technical terms. And another thing I hear often is the desire for different state agencies to have consistency of lean between agencies. And from the Results Washington perspective, this can be a little bit tough because there's this really careful balance between having lean at all agencies, and it's recognizable, it's something that we're all using, and giving agencies enough autonomy to be able to make sure that it works within their existing systems. So there's this balance between being overly prescriptive and overly flexible. And we want to try and hit the center. So what do I mean by overly? One thing we do in that case is that we can focus on principles instead of exactly how to do something. So an example of that could be, imagine you work at a coffee shop, and the coffee shop owners are focused on customer satisfaction and want to make customer satisfaction improve. And so they say from now on, you cannot turn your back to the customer. You have to always be facing the customer, and that's a standard, and you have to adhere to it. And if you're working there, you're kind of like, well, but the machine is back there. Like, how do I get the coffee and serve the customer if I can't ever turn my back? It's kind of silly, right? So it's a well-intentioned thing, but the prescriptiveness of that thing doesn't actually work for that scenario. So the company evolves and they realize, well, maybe that's not possible. Maybe what we need to do is focus on the principle instead. And the principle is maintain customer focus. So it's absolutely essential that everyone maintains or customer focus and the principle, but the way you get that done has a little bit of flexibility. And you can use your judgment, and you can find out the best ways to do it within your own environment. So that kind of thinking is what we at Results Washington have advocated for, that all agencies and all employees understand lean and use lean, but we're not necessarily going to say you have to do it exactly this way with exactly this method. So gPDCA, this is a great one where principles apply because you might have heard different iterations of this. You might have heard just PDCA, and that can stand for Plan, Do, Check, Act, Plan, Do, Check, Adjust, Plan, Do, Study, Adjust. So there's different versions. But what it essentially is, G stands for grasp the situation, and that's about deeply understanding what's currently happening. And once you deeply understand what's currently happening, how big is your problem? What type of problem are you trying to solve? How can you get data to understand that issue better? Then you make a plan. And once you have your plan, you do that plan. And once you've done that plan, or as you're doing that plan, you check the results of that plan. See how is it going? And then you adjust your approach and decide what actions you need to take for that continuous improvement cycle. And by the way, check doesn't mean just like checking a box. And that's why sometimes people call it study as well, because that implies sort of more rigorous analysis. But it's really about verifying the results of what is happening with your plan. How well is it working? What needs to be adjusted? So the G is really important in this method. And the reason for that is because theoretically, you could plan something without ever fully understanding what's currently happening. So it is possible to make plans and take action without really clearly understanding what problem you're solving or what issue you're going after. And that's really grasping the situation is helping you deeply understand. And in fact, we go straight to action all the time, right? Like we plan and we do stuff, and we plan and we do more. And we may forget to check the results of our plan, and we may forget to really make adjustments intentionally. And we plan and we plan and we do and we do. And I've once heard this affectionately called the PP-do-do cycle. And so obviously none of us wants to be associated to creating PP and do-do all the time. And so the gPDCA cycle can help us avoid that just being in constant action without ever actually seeing if what we're doing is working. Another one that I love talking about is 8 wastes. And the reason I love it is because it can be so impactful when you can eliminate waste and make improvements. So we're going to use both sides of our handout for this part. If you flip on the opposite side of the questions, you'll see a list of the 8 wastes. I'm not going to go through them all, but you guys can probably imagine how some of them impact your life. You know, how many people have had too many emails? You open up your inbox and you've got 200 emails, 70 unread, 20 aren't even relevant at all. That's overwhelming. That doesn't feel good. Or you're waiting, like you need to get something done in your work and you're waiting for someone else to get their part done before you can finish your work. or your skills aren't valued, or you make a mistake. Like, this doesn't feel good. Waste feels bad, and it can feel bad in ways that are anywhere from icky and annoying all the way to demoralizing or worse. I had an experience a few months ago, actually for the Lean conference, where I was just given access to our email box to send out like mass distribution emails. And so I was familiarized with that process, and it struck me as a little complex and maybe prone to error, but I went ahead with it. And I accidentally sent an email out to 300 people with the wrong subject line. And I didn't even know it until I started getting all these out-of-office bounce backs. And I'm like, why am I getting all this stuff for this weird subject line? And then I'm like, oh, no, you can't take that back, and then you have to fix it. Waste doesn't feel good. But fortunately, I'm in an environment where my leader and coach understands that I'm human and I make mistakes as well, and that the process itself could use some improvement. And so that's what we did. A coworker and I looked at the process and we made improvements. And without going into detail, now I can send those emails without ever being afraid that I'm going to make that mistake again. How much relief can I have that I'm never going to make that mistake again? I might make other mistakes, and I'll work with those when I do that as well if it happens. But that mistake itself doesn't even exist in the process. It's impossible to do because we took it out. How good does that feel when you can eliminate waste, when you can improve your own sense of security because you're going to be doing your work on time, and you're not going to have defects, and you're not overwhelmed with crazy amounts of inventory? So, learning a little bit about some tools. Earlier, or just a couple minutes ago, we talked about gPDCA. The G standing for grasp the situation, deeply understanding what's currently happening. And there's a lot of tools that can apply to that, and one of them is mapping. So on the screen is what we called a value stream map. And what those do is they map the process from the time a process starts to the point that value is delivered to the customer. And that value can be a product or a service. And so it shows you all the different steps that happen in that process and has ways that you can analyze that information. So this kind of map is really great for showing things like how much time the process is taking. You can look at time overall, within steps, between steps. Sometimes there's a lot of waiting. It can show you where errors are happening. It can show you where things are bottlenecked or not flowing. A big concept in Lean is flow, that we want to achieve flow in our processes. And where things aren't flowing is a pretty good place to look for waste. You're pretty much going to find waste where things aren't flowing. It can also show you where you're duplicating steps. I can't tell you how many times I've done value stream maps with people or similar types of activities, and we get close to the end of the thing, and it's like, okay, well, it goes to the first review. All right, great. And there's some time in between. Okay, second review, time in between. Okay, third review. Okay, and then final review. Great. 4 reviews. Do we really need all those? So this mapping process is a way to be able to make your process visible so that you can start to engage those kinds of conversations. Identify the wastes within the process and figure out how you want to eliminate some and make it better. So another method is the spaghetti diagram. So up on the screen on the right-hand side is an example of a spaghetti diagram. And it's called spaghetti diagram, you can probably imagine, because of all the squiggly lines on the thing look a little bit like spaghetti. But what it's tracking is the movement. This particular one is tracking movement around the office of people. And so it's trying to tackle their problem of what they perceived as wasted motion. And in fact, when they mapped it out, they did have a lot of wasted motion. But you can also use this method to track things like how products move and how information moves as well. So these are just 2 examples of mapping techniques. There's a lot more that we don't have time to go into today. But the important thing about mapping is that you're doing it to make your problems visible. You're doing it so that you can find the opportunities to improve. Every once in a while, a long time ago when I first started, I noticed that both myself and sometimes other people would get caught up in wanting to make the map perfect. Doesn't matter if the map is perfect. What matters is, can you see what waste exists and where things need to be adjusted so that you can improve your process? The other thing it's really good for is aligning around those improvements, because you don't usually make these maps in a vacuum. You're usually doing it with other team members, and so it's a way to have a shared conversation around what's happening as well. All right, so mapping is an awesome tool to understand current state, deeply understand what's happening. Problem solving, the overall overarching problem, one of my favorite topics. So on the screen you see different versions of problem solving. My favorite is A3 problem solving, but there's a lot of others out there. And again, this is an example where as long as they're adhering to the principles that are important, it's okay to use different methods. So others that I've heard of are 8-step problem solving, 4-step, DMAIC, and there's even more. If you searched on the internet, you could find lots and lots of iterations of this. The important things that we want to be thinking about in problem solving is that we're using a systematic way to solve problems, and that has to do with understanding why it matters to the customer, deeply understanding what's actually happening. What problem are we actually even trying to solve? Let's get really clear about that. What data and information can we gather to inform that question? Analyzing, doing some analysis, what are the causes of the problem? Instead of just jumping to a solution, how can we be sure that we're actually identifying what's really the cause of what we're trying to go after? And then intentionally coming up with measures that will counteract that cause. And then checking and adjusting. You've come up with a measure, you're going to put that into place. You want to see if it actually helped you solve your problem or not. So again, that check and adjust phase, very important, that we often forget. We often try to solve a problem and then we leave it and forget about it without going back to see if it actually worked. So how many of us have ever jumped to a solution when we heard something was going on and we just said, oh, I know what to do to fix that. No, we don't need to explore more, I know what we need to do. So that's really common, right? Like everyone does that. And in fact, there's research about how our brains work, that we're more comfortable in that frame of mind generally, typically, that we want to try and fix things quickly, like it's in our nature to do so. But doing that, jumping to a solution without understanding cause, can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. And occasionally, it can even make your problem worse. So when I first did my first A3, it was at Results, Washington. And we were practicing on a personal problem first so that we could learn on something easier before applying it to something really big and multi-agency kind of thing. And so I focused on, what's something that's bugging me at home? Well, I have all these stacks of mail around my house. And so how can I solve that problem? And I think I called it mail routing and organization. And I kind of knew that I needed to create a better routing and organization system for myself. But because I was engaging the methodology and systematically solving this problem, I was challenged to go and actually observe and measure what was happening in my house. And what that looked like was counting the number of piles and the number of rooms and actually taking an inventory of what was in those piles. And when I took an inventory, I was surprised. I found weird stuff in there. I had movie ticket stubs, I had artwork from my niece, I had my passport. Thank goodness I wasn't traveling at the time because I did not know it was in that pile. And so all of a sudden my mail problem was no longer a mail problem. And if I hadn't done the problem solving and I just threw my own solution at it without thinking about it more, I was actually missing the majority of what was going on, which had nothing whatsoever to do with mail. So this is a really simplistic example, but it's a good one to show that sometimes the problem we think we have is not the problem we actually have. And so if we throw a solution at it without finding cause and we're surprised why that didn't work, well, problem-solving methodologies can help us avoid that scenario. It can help us work through to find things that will work and make sure we're checking and adjusting so that we can continue good problem solving. So we've kind of blasted through a whole bunch of concepts in a really short time frame. So right now, I think it's important to remember why are we talking about this. And the reason we're doing these things is to produce great results for customers. And in improving our processes and in producing great results for customers, we're also going to be improving our own lives as employees. So lean is a way of leading and working built on respect and humility that uses continuous improvement to produce great results for customers. So understanding that it's all that, you can begin to get a sense of why sometimes it takes some time to develop the culture, and maybe our journey does evolve over the course of years. And I want to acknowledge the fact that we really did just breeze through so many things. This was really a very high-level introduction, and that we really didn't even talk about like how you do a lot of this stuff. There's so much to learn about how do you create culture, how do you put in management systems. But I wanted you to have a sprinkling of enough information that you can start to contextualize the rest of the conference and what you're hearing. So I also want to share that some things that you go and see back at your agency, they're going to be outside of your control. So not every problem or not every waste is yours to address or fix. But with that said, there's a lot that's within your control. So what can you take back? What can you do? What mindsets can you engage that maybe you learned about today? What wastes that you maybe didn't know about could you see in your own processes? What improvement ideas, even if it's only on your own email or something simple that just you touch, what ideas could you do to apply continuous improvement, gPDCA?